Good morning, and thank you all for having come along today to this conference. Thank you to all those who are joining us virtually, and it's an immense pleasure and a privilege to be here as one of your two co-presidents, and Caroline Lucas is also present, and you will be hearing, there she is. I was about to wonder where she disappeared to, but Caroline is there. We are both delighted to be here together. And the fact that you have co-presidents drawn from different areas of the political spectrum is, I think, a telling indication of what brings us all together. And what I wanted to do, because I was asked to do the warm-up act for this event, was to say I'd like to go, to take Margaret Thatcher's old term, back to basics. Because I think going back to basics is quite important about what we are all about. And I actually want to take you back 80 years. 80 years ago, my father, who was then aged 29, was in Luxembourg. Now, it wasn't Luxembourg because it was the center, one of the centers of the EU. It was Luxembourg because it was a battered place that had just been liberated in September 1944, and where, in fact, the Germans were still in occupation in early February of a northern section of the country up in the Ardennes. And my father was a junior staff officer on the SHAEF military mission to Luxembourg, actually led by an American colonel, and he was the number 2. And they were there to provide all the link up between the armed forces in Luxembourg and the Luxembourg Civil Authority. That was the job. I think my father said afterwards, one of the most interesting roles he ever had in his life, and he was very privileged to do it. But the interesting thing was that for my father, it was one of those really formative experiences, because he came from what I might probably describe, not typical, but nevertheless, right of center, British background. Grandfather who'd been out in Burma as a merchant in the late 19th century. Great believer in pride in Britain. But he was absolutely certain by the end of the Second World War that only a closer form of European Union would work for the future of our country. And indeed, many of the links and the friendships which he made in those days in Luxembourg, often with very young Luxembourgers who went on to become Prime Minister of Luxembourg and fulfill other functions in that tiny country, absolutely persuaded him of the necessity of doing this. And interestingly, it wasn't just people like my father of the center-right who came to this very clear conviction. It was also those on the left and center-left. So when my father finally got into Parliament in the 1960s, the people he cooperated with, like Roy Jenkins and others, and Liberals, Joe Grimmond, was all about furthering UK integration into Europe, because the absolute underlying conviction they had that we should never have another war on the European continent, that actually the standards and values that were being developed across the European continent matched our own, and in many ways, actually, I'll come back to this in a moment, matched our own better than those which existed across the Atlantic in the United States, which is a much more free-for-all country based on its past and its history. And that if we only could achieve this, it would deliver a good quality of life for all European citizens. That was the aim. My father certainly wasn't a federalist. He didn't believe in subsuming the UK into some supranational state. He never thought that that was, in fact, where the destiny was going to be. It was about confederation. It was about bringing people together as equals to cooperate and have common institutions for the common good. And it worked. Oh, I know, the detractors like to say that since 2008, it's all been a rocky road. But when you actually look at what happened between 1945 right through into the 21st century, the development of European cooperation at multiple levels has been one of the most extraordinary successes, delivering growth, quality of life, and although that's often difficult to reconcile with environmental considerations, actually developing in much of the European continent levels of environmental protection which are very high by world standards. All those things brought together by that cooperation. And here we are now, 80 years down that track. And you look across to Munich yesterday, and you have Mr. Trump. And if ever there was an indication that we have arrived at a fundamental dividing point between the ideas that Europeans have of how they wish to structure their societies, and I regret to say, the ideas which now seem to be increasingly prevailing in the United States, but bluntly speaking, have been latent and around for quite a long time, we have it openly being presented to us. Now, of course, we may all want, I certainly want, I hope that Trump will row back. We certainly don't wish to end our partnership with the United States, and I'm afraid we have to face the fact that we have allowed it to turn into a partnership of dependency, certainly when it comes to our national security. And that is years of wishful thinking, because to my mind, the writing has been on the wall for some time that it was not necessarily sustainable, Trump or no Trump. And not only do we have that, but we also have a president of the United States who is articulating principles of the way in which nations should conduct their business, which you might just about argue is a throwback to the 17th century, but is not where I, or I suspect any of you in this room, wish to see it. And it pains me to note the extent to which, particularly some of my former colleagues or people who said they were conservatives, not the conservatism I ever practiced, seem to have been attracted to this. And now, if you open your page of The Spectator for the end of this week, you can see Fraser Nelson sort of looking a bit tremulous as he contemplates the extraordinary nature of American-US foreign policy today. But it's the logical conclusion of any principle which puts the short-term interests of nation states ahead of the long-term interests of international cooperation. And to have that at the same time as we have commentators like Mr. Hannon, who blathers on about the UK projecting power in the Far East and how the Royal Navy is the second most powerful navy in the world. Yes, he did say that last year. We've only currently got 18 surface vessels in commission, apart from the aircraft carriers. It seems to me to show what happens when you pursue the politics of fantasy. So we have the most intense challenge, because I think very, very quickly we are going to have to step up. And in fairness, it's not just the United Kingdom that has to step up. It's Germany, it's France, it's Italy and Spain and Poland. It's the bigger countries within the European Union and outside of it who share those values, who are going to have to step up about what the future of Europe is actually going to be. Now, that actually requires looking also at the EU and its institutions, because we can't escape the fact that one of the reasons we ended up where we were in 2016, apart from the fantasy politics of the right, there was discontent and there were aspects of the European Union which were not functioning properly and were too bureaucratic. So the challenge is across the board. But that doesn't mean to say that challenge can be met without us. It can't. and thinking people in France and Germany do it. So it's also, for this back to basics moment, of great opportunity, because we've got to get this right. I think out there is a public that is increasingly receptive. Message that if you think the United Kingdom can go it alone, if you think the United Kingdom can be the sidekick of the United States and that will solve our problems, both are fantasies. The only way we will manage our future and make the contribution which our country can work with our neighbours. Now, in the course of this grassroots conference, you'll have a lot about campaigning. There are lots of things that we can be campaigning about. We can be campaigning about closer economic cooperation. We can get away from these fantasies about free trade deals with the United States and face up to the fact that financial alignment, yes, not a deal, but I'm afraid that's the pay for your stupidities. And we should have that. We can also talk about help young generation engage. I mean, here's the Times talking about Generation Z, and I don't blame Generation Z. Happy. But they would be less depressed and less unhappy if they were looking at the opportunities that are available on our continent. So bringing Erasmus back and having freedom of movement just makes absolute, complete, and total sense. And finally, last but not least, to cooperate for our security. And let's face it, Trump's made it quite clear, Ukraine will not be sustained by NATO. So who is going to sustain it? Well, the answer is, unless we're going to end up in a very, very bad place, it is those European countries cooperating together which have the power and capacity to do it. France, Germany, essentially. Others might help. But we have to do it. Because if Putin wins, then we are being caught between an amoral US presidency and a thoroughly immoral Russian one. And where we are, small countries just end up being bullied unless they can see their self-interest is sufficient together. One of the things which gives me pleasure is I am the British member of a thing called the Institut Jean Monnet in France. Monnet is regarded as the... But actually, although he helped create the EEC, Monnet started his work the very when he turned up he was rather naughtily. He was aged 26. He was a merchant selling cognac. The inestimable advantage, he'd spent years in Britain, so he actually rather liked them, which French sometimes don't, but he really liked them. And he went to see the French president, who he knew by some acquaintance, and he said, Mr. President, this was 1916, our defense procurement is crazy. We are competing on world markets with the British to buy the same materials that we both need to fight the same. And that's how he started his career, and he did the same thing in the Second World War. And he famously, I think we need to remember it, he said, it's only when you face a crisis that countries realize about the need to cooperate together. And that is our mission. That's what we're going to go out to sell in the course of the coming year. You are very good at doing it, and we'll discuss that later. And always keep in the background the famous comment of Henry Tizard, the great scientist, who said to Churchill in about 1949, when Churchill was banging on a bit about imperial or post. He said, he said to Churchill, Winston, is not a great power, but it can be a great country. was the message that was picked up by those generations that took us into the EEC, and it's what should underpin what our work is all about. Because we will become a great country again when we are cooperating with the people who are around us, share our values, and on whom our security and quality of life depends.